Welcome back. 0002480. In the fading light of the 1820s, the name Hartwell carried weight in Pennsylvania. Jeremiah Hartwell was known as a prosperous iron merchant, a man whose fortunes grew with the expanding railroads and steel mills that were reshaping the young nation. To the public eye, his family embodied refinement, discipline, and wealth. But behind the closed shutters of the mansion on the outskirts of Pittsburgh, a darker story had already begun to unfold. 00024-200. The Hartwell mansion itself became the first character in this tale. A vast three-story estate constructed in 1824, with looming gables, imported marble fireplaces, and corridors that twisted like veins through the stone body of the house. Its grandeur impressed neighbors, but visitors often remarked on its unsettling silence. Servants whispered of hidden passages and mirrors that seemed to watch rather than reflect, and although most dismissed such claims as idle talk, the unease lingered in the air long after one stepped inside. 00025-640. Jeremiah's first wife, Margaret Dunlap, was regarded as a woman of considerable charm and intelligence. She came from an old Pittsburgh family, admired for her wit and her knowledge of literature and music. Yet within a year of her marriage, strange reports began to circulate. Neighbors noted how Margaret, once vibrant, seemed to wither before their eyes. She complained of sleepless nights, of footsteps echoing through empty corridors, of food and drink that left a bitter taste upon her tongue. Soon she spoke of shadows moving behind her when she was alone, of whispers filtering through the walls that no one else could hear. 0027359. Jeremiah insisted that his wife suffered from nervous exhaustion, a condition all too familiar to physicians of the time. Doctors agreed, prescribing tonics and enforced rest, claiming her imaginative tendencies had tipped into hysteria. Yet servants confided in hushed tones that Margaret's decline seemed unnatural, as though her body were fighting against something invisible. Her hands trembled when she held a teacup, her skin turned pale and fragile, almost translucent in candlelight. 02154-080. Within 3 years of the marriage, Margaret was committed to the newly opened Pennsylvania Hospital for the Insane, a facility touted as a progressive institution, but feared by those who knew its iron gates and locked wards. Jeremiah, appearing devastated, explained to acquaintances that his wife's condition left him no choice. Margaret lived out her final years within those walls, her testimony dismissed as the ravings of madness. When she died in 1832, her death was recorded as natural, an end to what many believed had been a tragic but ordinary case of mental collapse. 020. At the time, these writings were ignored, sealed away with her belongings. They would only resurface years later, when investigators reopened her case under grimly different circumstances. 025-359. In the months following Margaret's death, Jeremiah remarried with surprising swiftness. His second wife, Elena Rodriguez, came from a Spanish merchant family involved in the shipping of textiles. Elena was younger than Margaret, spirited, and by all accounts deeply in love with her husband. For a time, her arrival seemed to lift the atmosphere of the mansion. Guests reported hearing laughter at the long dining table again, and Elena's charm softened Jeremiah's rigid demeanor. 020-22. Elena began to complain of a burning in her throat after meals, of dizziness, and of strange dreams in which mirrors opened like windows into hidden chambers. She confided to her maid Sarah Quinn that she believed the house itself was conspiring against her, that walls shifted during the night, and that Jeremiah watched her even when he was absent. Sarah, who would later become one of the most crucial witnesses, remembered Elena's terror vividly. 025-200. At first, Jeremiah dismissed his wife's fears as nerves, but when Elena's health worsened, her once lively frame growing gaunt, her eyes hollowing with constant unease, he began arranging frequent visits from Dr. Wilhelm Zimmermann, a German physician experimenting with chemical treatments. Zimmermann administered drafts that Elena was told would strengthen her nerves, though they often left her trembling and incoherent. The community, unaware of the true nature of these concoctions, believed Jeremiah was a devoted husband sparing no expense to aid his afflicted wife. 024-28. She too spoke of being poisoned, of her husband's strange fixation with mirrors, and of the sense that unseen hands were guiding her thoughts. By late 1834 she was bedridden, her days a haze of confusion punctuated by startling moments of lucidity in which she begged Sarah Quinn not to leave her side. Unlike Margaret, Elena survived. Her eventual testimony would become one of the foundations of the prosecution's case against Jeremiah. 02458. Neighbors began to wonder why two young wives of the same man had lost their minds in such similar fashion, and why Jeremiah seemed untouched by tragedy, carrying on his business dealings with ruthless efficiency. Some speculated that the Hartwell estate was cursed. Others suspected Jeremiah himself, though few dared voice it openly. In an era where women's complaints were so often dismissed as hysteria, the possibility of deliberate harm was nearly unthinkable. 0253327. It was not until Sarah Quinn risked her position and reputation by sharing what she had seen inside the mansion that suspicions hardened into something dark. She described late-night deliveries of small glass vials, the metallic scent that clung to Jeremiah's study, and the chilling instructions she overheard him give Dr. Zimmerman, that the treatments must mimic madness without causing immediate death. 02558. By the end of 1835, with Margaret already dead and Elena hovering near it, investigators began to take interest in the strange tragedies of the Hartwell household. What they uncovered would shake Pennsylvania to its core, exposing not merely one man's cruelty, but an entire network of physicians and businessmen who had weaponized medicine itself. 02622. Over the next decade, 3 more wives would pass through the doors of the Hartwell mansion, each destined to suffer the same fate: madness, silence, and in most cases, an early grave. 0264176. The story of the Hartwell family was not simply one of private cruelty, but a reflection of a society willing to dismiss women's voices, to confine them in asylums rather than question the men who claimed authority over them. Each chapter of this grim saga pulled the curtain back further, revealing that the horror was not confined to a single house, but was rooted in the very foundations of power, medicine, and gender in 19th century America. 027-12. 400. Tonight we begin the journey into that darkness, retracing the steps of 5 women who entered the Hartwell mansion as brides and were consumed by its shadows. Was it madness? Was it poison? Or was it something more insidious? An entire system built to silence those whose voices threatened the men who held power. The House of Mirrors. 02730. The newspapers never printed a word against Jeremiah Hartwell, whose donations to the city's charities and influence over the railroad investors kept his reputation intact. But in the taverns and parlors of Pittsburgh, whispers swirled like smoke. 2 wives, both undone by nervous collapse, both confined to their rooms before vanishing into silence. 02758. 720. The servants, who rotated frequently as few stayed more than a year, carried the most vivid tales. They spoke of how Jeremiah would insist every mirror in the house remain uncovered, even at night, as if reflections themselves were a source of study. New maids reported feeling uneasy when passing through the East Wing, where portraits of Margaret and Elena hung side by side, their painted eyes following visitors as though with warning. The older staff avoided that corridor altogether, muttering of cold drafts and unexplained creaks in the paneling. 020. But Sarah Quinn, Elena's maid, was not so easily silenced. Determined to protect her mistress, she kept careful notes of the oddities she observed. Years later, her testimony would prove indispensable. She described how Jeremiah and Dr. Zimmerman often met in the study late into the night, the heavy oak door barred shut. Through the thin walls she heard the clinking of glass, the hiss of flame, and at times a faint metallic odor strong enough to sting her nostrils from the corridor. She also noticed Jeremiah's peculiar insistence that Elena drink only what he provided her. 020. Or 859-600. Elena herself confided that the taste of her wine had turned foul metallic, as though steeped in coins. She began refusing her husband's draughts, hiding the untouched cups beneath her bed. On one occasion, Sarah discovered a small vial tucked into Elena's pillowcase, a cloudy solution with a bitter odor she could not identify. When confronted, Jeremiah dismissed it as a tonic, but his anger at Sarah's intrusion was so severe that she feared for her position. 020. By midsummer, Elena's condition had worsened. She complained of hallucinations, corridors elongating, mirrors reflecting rooms that did not exist, and a constant whispering chorus that seemed to follow her step. Sarah later testified that she too once glimpsed something unusual. While polishing a mirror in Elena's chamber, she swore she saw the reflection of a figure standing just behind her, though when she turned the room was empty. 020 CT. Jeremiah explained his wife's condition as hereditary madness, citing her Spanish temperament as inherently unstable. Few challenged him. In the medical journals of the day, one finds frequent references to the supposed fragility of women's minds. Physicians echoed his claims, and Elena, like Margaret before her, was dismissed as another victim of feminine weakness. 020 CT. Jeremiah's deterioration could not be so neatly contained. Unlike Margaret, she lived long enough to speak clearly of what was being done to her. In September 1836, during one of her rare lucid intervals, she dictated a letter to Sarah, addressed to her brother in Philadelphia. In it she claimed that her husband was deliberately administering poison in measured doses, designed to weaken her body and unravel her sanity without killing her outright. She named Dr. Zimmerman as his accomplice, accusing them of experimenting with what she called slow alchemy upon the human frame. 020 CT. Jeremiah 720. The letter, however, never reached its intended recipient. Sarah later discovered it burned in the hearth of Jeremiah's study. How it came there, no one could say, but the implication was clear. 020 CT. Jeremiah 20 CT. Jeremiah 20 CT. A dismissed coachman claimed to have transported wooden crates from the mansion late at night, their contents clinking like bot. Another servant swore he discovered a hidden compartment beneath the dining room floorboards, filled with small corked vials. Both men disappeared from Pittsburgh within weeks, either through intimidation or bribery. Their absence only deepened suspicion. 020 CT. Jeremiah CT. Jeremiah 20 CT. Jeremiah CT. By winter, Elena's body had grown frail, her mind fractured by alternating clarity and confusion. At times she begged Sarah to run with her, to escape the house entirely. At others, she seemed almost resigned, murmuring that the mirrors were recording her every gesture for some unknown purpose. Sarah would later insist that she saw Jeremiah standing in Elena's chamber at night, not speaking, merely watching her sleep as though waiting for some final transformation to complete. 012, 12, 12, 720. What made the case so compelling and so damning was the consistency of the symptoms between Jeremiah's first and second wives. Margaret had spoken of poison, metallic tastes, and voices in the walls. Elena, separated by years, described the same. Both were consigned to silence under the label of insanity, and both were connected to Jeremiah's obsessive interest in chemical tinctures and reflective surfaces. 012, 4120. By early 1837, city officials began to take interest. A quiet inquiry was launched, led by a magistrate named Thomas Brigham, who had heard rumors of the Hartwell tragedies through his own physician brother. Brigham's first step was to interview Sarah Quinn, who, despite her fear, agreed to recount what she had witnessed. Her testimony painted a picture, not of random madness, but of deliberate systematic experimentation within the walls of the Hartwell estate. 020 CT. Jeremiah, furious at the intrusion, nonetheless complied, opening his doors with calculated politeness. What Brigham found was chilling. In the locked study, he uncovered shelves lined with bottles, powders, and preserved organs sealed in glass. Among the papers scattered on Jeremiah's desk were notes detailing the effects of various compounds on the nervous system, each entry marked, not with scientific terminology, but with the initials of women. MD for Margaret Dunlap, ER for Elena Rodriguez. 020 CT. Jeremiah CT. Jeremiah 20 CT. Jeremiah CT. Jeremiah pages filled with careful notations. Brigham later testified that the entries recorded not finances, but dosages administered over time, with accompanying descriptions of symptoms, tremors, hallucinations, paranoia, and eventual collapse. These records were clinical, detached and precise, evidence that the suffering of Jeremiah's wives had been not accidental, but orchestrated. 020 CT. Jeremiah 20 CT. Yet astonishingly, Brigham's findings did not lead to immediate arrest. Jeremiah's wealth and influence shielded him. He argued that his research was purely medical, intended to advance understanding of mental illness. Dr. Zimmerman defended the experiments as legitimate, claiming the women's conditions had only revealed predispositions already present, and in a society predisposed to mistrust women's accounts of their own suffering, the argument found willing ears. 020 CT. Jeremiah 20 CT. Jeremiah, however, survived long enough to undermine these defenses. In 1838, weak but lucid, she dictated a sworn statement before Magistrate Brigham, accusing her husband of intentional poisoning and mental torture. Her words, trembling though they were, carried undeniable weight. I have been treated not as a wife but as an instrument. My mind dismantled piece by piece. 020 CT. Or testimony ignited the scandal that could no longer be contained. For the first time, newspapers began to hint at impropriety in the Hartwell household. Editorials questioned how two wives could suffer the same fate, how Jeremiah's medical studies could align so neatly with their decline. And though his fortune still afforded him allies, the seeds of doubt had been planted. 020 CT. The house had become more than a residence. It was a stage upon which Jeremiah rehearsed his sinister designs, refining them with each new bride. 020 16 09 12. The question lingered in every whispered conversation, in every hushed gathering. Were the Hartwell wives victims of one man's cruelty, or of something far more insidious? A tradition, a science, a doctrine that sanctioned their suffering. The answers would not emerge until blood, betrayal, and fire consumed the estate. The third bride. 020 16 41 28. By the time Elena Rodriguez gave her sworn testimony in 1838, the Hartwell estate was already preparing to welcome another mistress. That fact alone unsettled many in the city. Two wives broken by madness, and yet Jeremiah, unshaken by scandal, sought another. To his critics, it appeared indecent. To his supporters, it was evidence of resilience, of a man refusing to be crushed by personal tragedy. 020 17 056. Her name was Catherine Whitcomb, a young woman of English descent, daughter of a shipping magnate, with ties to the growing steel trade. She was 20 years Jeremiah's junior, with a reputation for intelligence and sharp wit. Where Margaret had been soft-spoken and Elena passionate, Catherine was quick with questions, unafraid to challenge even men of influence. Some whispered that Jeremiah chose her precisely because of her sharpness, because breaking her mind would be the ultimate proof of his method. 020 17 37 9 12. Their wedding, in the autumn of 1839, was a spectacle of wealth, attended by Pittsburgh's elite, but beneath the champagne toasts and glittering chandeliers, the city hummed with unease. Sarah Quinn, by then dismissed from service, warned acquaintances that Catherine was walking into a gilded prison. Her words were dismissed as bitterness. The Hartwells remained untouchable. 020. She took immediate interest in the house's many rooms, asking questions about the locked doors and hidden corridors. Servants reported that she often lingered before the portraits of Margaret and Elena, staring long enough that Jeremiah would gently draw her away, insisting they dine or walk the gardens instead. 020 CN. Months passed without incident, and many thought perhaps the curse of the Hartwell wives had ended. But by early 1840, signs began to emerge. Catherine developed what she described as episodes of distortion. The corridors of the East Wing would stretch into impossible lengths, the clocks would tick out of rhythm, and in the mirrors, she claimed to see versions of herself older, gaunter, twisted by years she had not lived. 020 CT.
It is not madness that I feel, but intrusion. Something foreign moves within my veins, altering my senses, commanding my thoughts. The house is not haunted by spirits, but by experiments written upon my body. Load 1 in 1926. 400 servants corroborated her accounts, noting that Jeremiah once again forbade his wife to consume anything not prepared by his own hand. Meals were meticulously portioned, drinks carefully measured. When Catherine resisted, Jeremiah accused her of hysteria, a charge that in those days carried more authority than any protest she might make. Load 1 in 1950. 800. By summer, her health declined. Her once lively eyes grew hollow, her speech slurred at times, and her temper swung between brilliance and despair. In the town, rumors spread that she had inherited a nervous condition. Jeremiah, ever prepared, distributed letters to family and acquaintances explaining her delicate nature and claiming her breakdown was inevitable. Load 1 in 1920. On August 3, 1840, she confided to a visiting cousin that she believed Jeremiah was conducting medical trials upon her without consent. The cousin, alarmed, attempted to raise the matter with city officials, but the complaint vanished into bureaucratic silence. Some believe Jeremiah's influence bought their silence. Others suspect more sinister coercion. Load 1 in night. In October of that year, Catherine disappeared from public view altogether. Jeremiah announced she had taken ill and required rest. Yet within weeks the servants reported a chilling detail. Catherine's laughter, once bright, now echoed down the halls at night, disembodied, carrying a note of hysteria. One maid swore she saw Catherine wandering the east wing in her nightdress, conversing with her own reflection in the mirror as though it were another woman entirely. Though 1 and 23. The city whispered, 3 wives, 3 descents into madness. Could coincidence still be argued? Sarah Quinn returned to testify before Magistrate Brigham once more, insisting that what befell Catherine was a continuation of Jeremiah's cruel pattern. But the law was slow, and wealth defended him well. Though 1 and 21 45 920. In late 1841, Catherine vanished altogether. Jeremiah declared her dead, claiming she had succumbed to brain fever. No grave was marked, no obituary published. Only years later, during an excavation of the Hartwell grounds, would fragments of bone and fabric be found sealed beneath the floorboards of the estate's east wing. Though 1 and 2013 200. Catherine's fate sealed Jeremiah's reputation in hushed tones. He was no longer merely unlucky in marriage, but a man touched by something darker. And yet astonishingly, society continued to embrace him. In 1842 he was appointed to the board of a local medical society, where his writings on the degeneration of female nerves were discussed with interest. The same city that whispered behind closed doors applauded him in lecture halls. Though 1 and 22. Zimmerman's role had grown more explicit. Witnesses recalled him arriving at the mansion with heavy trunks of equipment, glass retorts, chemical powders, and preserved organs for dissection. Together he and Jeremiah fashioned what they described as a theater of medicine, though no patients other than Jeremiah's wives ever emerged from their study. Though 1 and 23 1 and 44. A chilling note discovered in Zimmerman's hand decades later read, "The female constitution is uniquely suited for prolonged experiment. Their susceptibility to nervous excitation provides fertile ground for observing the boundary between reason and delirium." Though 1 and 23 37 36. These words confirmed what survivors already knew. The Hartwell estate had become a laboratory in disguise, its wives reduced to subjects, their suffering recorded not as tragedy but as data. Though 1 and 23 544. Catherine's death or disappearance did not end Jeremiah's pursuit. In 1843, scarcely a year later, he married again. This time his bride was Anne Fletcher, the daughter of a prominent judge. With each union, Jeremiah climbed higher in influence, weaving himself into the very structure of Pittsburgh's elite. And with each bride the pattern of madness repeated, as though the house itself demanded it. Though 1 and 24 25 280. Anne Fletcher's descent would prove even more spectacular. For unlike her predecessors, she resisted fiercely, refusing to accept Jeremiah's explanation. It was her defiance that would ultimately drag the Hartwell secrets into the light. But before that reckoning, Catherine's ghost lingered in every corner of the estate. Servants swore they heard her voice in the night, whispering warnings in broken tone. Guests claimed to glimpse her figure at the top of the staircase, watching silently before dissolving into shadow. Though 1 and 24 50. Whether he preserved it as evidence of triumph or as material for future refinement, no one could say. Though 1 and 25 20. Each one had borne witness to Jeremiah's slow alchemy. Each one had descended into the same abyss of madness, and yet society allowed it to continue. The fourth bride. Though 1 and 26. Though 1 and 20. When Anne Fletcher entered the Hartwell estate in the winter of 1843, society greeted the match with unease. She was the daughter of Judge Horace Fletcher, a man of considerable influence in Pennsylvania. The marriage was not merely a union of two families but a consolidation of power between the courts and the industries of Pittsburgh. Though 1 and 26 33. At 27, she was older than Catherine had been, more measured in her temperament, and far less willing to accept explanations without proof. Contemporary descriptions paint her as sharp-eyed, self-possessed, and unafraid to voice her suspicion. In private letters to her sister, she expressed discomfort with the estate almost immediately. Though 1 and 26 58 200. One letter, dated February 2, 1844, survives in the Fletcher family archives. Anne wrote, "The house is a cage of polished wood and velvet curtain. Its beauty hides something I cannot name. I feel watched even when alone.
Jeremiah speaks of my constitution as if it were soil to be tilled, fertile for his studies. I do not trust his kindness. Though 1 in 26, 4. By spring, tensions grew within the household. Anne refused to follow Jeremiah's strict dietary regimens. When he presented tinctures and draughts of his own devising, she questioned their purpose, demanding to know the ingredient. Servants recall heated arguments behind closed doors, Jeremiah's calm voice pitched against Anne's cutting defiance. Though 1 in 27, 54, 3. Unlike Margaret, Elena, or Catherine, Anne sought allies. She established quiet friendships with the kitchen staff, with the laundress, even with the stable hand. She gathered details, asked questions, and pressed them about what had befallen the earlier wives. Many refused to speak, fearful of dismissal, but a few confessed their memories. The screams of Margaret, the trembling fits of Elena, the laughter of Catherine echoing down the hall. Though 1 in 28, 26, 7. In June of 1844, Anne reportedly confronted Jeremiah directly. A servant claimed to overhear her voice cutting through the heavy oak doors of the study. You call yourself a man of science, but what you practice is cruelty dressed as medicine. You will not make me another entry in your ledger. Though 1 in 28, 40. Instead, he exerted subtler forms of pressure, restricting her access to correspondence, dismissing sympathetic servants, and insisting upon long consultations with Dr. Zimmerman in the evenings. Anne, however, did not waver. Though 1 in 20 records show that Anne began secretly keeping her own account of events, a journal that would later surface in fragmented form during probate disputes. In one entry she wrote, "The walls of this house have been soaked in sorrow. I have touched the very panels where Catherine scratched with her nails. I have found threads of Margaret's gown in the east wing. Their voices are not gone. They press against the silence." Jeremiah calls it hysteria. I call it memory. Though 1 in 20 she refused Jeremiah's medicines, preferring to endure the symptoms without interference. She accused him in front of guests of poisoning her keys. Though 1 in 20 at a dinner in October 1844, she reportedly set down her glass of wine and declared to the assembled guests, "I will not drink what he pours, for it is not meant to heal, but to erode." The silence that followed was remembered for years. Jeremiah dismissed her accusation with a forced smile, calling it the melancholy imagination of a fragile mind. Though 1 in 2046, 8. Yet Anne's words spread quickly beyond the estate. For the first time the whispers reached the ears of men who could not be bought or silenced. Judge Fletcher, though reluctant to undermine his son-in-law, began to receive troubling letters from his daughter, smuggled out through sympathetic servants. She begged him to investigate, warning that she feared for her life. Though 1 in 1520, in December of that year, Sarah Quinn, the dismissed maid who had long sounded warnings, reappeared in court to deliver a new affidavit. She declared under oath that Jeremiah and Dr. Zimmerman had systematically broken the minds of each wife, through chemical concoctions and enforced isolation. Though many scoffed her testimony, paired with Anne's letters, could no longer be dismissed as slander. Though 1 in 26, and 5-6, it was around this time that Anne discovered the hidden chamber beneath the east wing. Accounts differ on how she found it, but most agree she followed the faint scent of decay to a loose panel in the floor. Inside she discovered remnants of garments, bone fragments, and stained journals written in Jeremiah's hand. Her notes, later recovered, described the horror in restrained but devastating prose. He does not study illness, he creates it. He measures it as though it were a crop. Each wife is a field, planted, harvested, discarded. Though 1 in 25, 4-8. Anne's discovery was the beginning of Jeremiah's unraveling. She smuggled pages of his journals to her father, who in turn pressed the local magistrates to act. But influence moved slowly, and Jeremiah anticipated the threat. Servants reported that in the final weeks of 1845, Anne was confined almost entirely to her room, her windows barred, her letters intercepted. Though 1 in 2046, Anne vanished from public sight altogether. Jeremiah announced that she had suffered a collapse of the nerves and was sent away to a sanatorium in New York. No such institution ever confirmed her presence. No death certificate was filed. Though 1 in 23, in 1872, during renovations of the Hartwell estate, Workers uncovered a series of inscriptions carved into the underside of the window ledge in the east wing. They read simply, "I am not insane, remember me, AF. 31 and 234536. Anne's resistance left a mark Jeremiah could not erase. Though he evaded conviction during his lifetime, suspicion began to cling to him in a way it had not before. Colleagues withdrew invitations, his lectures were less attended, rumors of vanished wives grew into a shadow that followed him everywhere. 31 and 25/6. Still, astonishingly, he married again, in 1847, less than a year after Anne's disappearance. Jeremiah took his fifth wife Isabella Crane, daughter of a wealthy ironworks owner. Her fate would prove the most catastrophic of all, for by then, Jeremiah had grown desperate, his experiments more reckless, his need to prove himself more consuming. 31 and 24. But before Isabella's tragic story, we must sit with Anne's defiance. She was the only wife who openly accused Jeremiah while still alive, the only one to leave behind tangible records of his cruelty, and the only one whose words continued to resonate. In many ways, her resistance broke the veil of silence, forcing the city to confront what it had allowed for far too long. The fifth bride, 31 and 2542. In the autumn of 1847, scarcely 7 months after Anne Fletcher vanished from sight, Isabella Crane entered the Hartwell estate as Jeremiah's fifth wife. The union was presented to the public with a pageantry that bordered on defiance. Newspapers described the ceremony in indulgent detail. The Crane family's carriages, adorned with silk ribbons, the Hartwell estate, dressed in ivy and white blossoms, Jeremiah himself standing at the altar with an almost funereal stillness. 31 and 26. 31 and 24. Isabella was the daughter of Nathaniel Crane, proprietor of one of the region's largest ironworks. Unlike the fragile Catherine or the scholarly Anne, Isabella was celebrated for her vivacity. At only 22, she was described as quick-witted, musically gifted, and possessed of a laughter that could fill a room. To those who knew her, the marriage seemed incongruous. Why would a spirited young woman tie herself to a man already shadowed by whisper? 31 and 26. 41 and 26. The answer was plain enough. Wealth and prestige. The Crane family stood to secure contracts with the Hartwell steel interests, and Jeremiah, now increasingly isolated by rumor, sought to anchor himself to another pillar of industry. The union was transactional, as cold as iron forged in the Crane furnaces. 31 and 20. From the first weeks, Isabella's presence unsettled the rhythm of the household. She sang in the drawing rooms, played the pianoforte late into the night, and dismissed Jeremiah's strict dietary orders with laughter. "I am not one of your patients," she was heard to say. Unlike Anne, Isabella did not resist with stern suspicion, but with irreverence. She teased, she mocked, and she embarrassed him in front of guests. 31 and 26. 800. Jeremiah endured this with outward calm, but his journals from that winter betray a tightening cruelty. One entry, dated December 19, 1847, reads, "The fifth wife resists, not with silence, nor with fear, but with derision. Such a temperament cannot be subdued by tincture or regimen. It must be broken as one breaks a colt, by isolation, by pressure, by the measured introduction of uncertainty." 31 and 28. 540. Servants noticed changes almost immediately. Isabella's laughter diminished. She withdrew from the drawing rooms, and was often confined to her chambers, curtains drawn, instruments untouched. Jeremiah claimed she suffered from nervous exhaustion brought on by womanly excess. Dr. Zimmerman made near-daily visits. 31 and 28. 27. 300. Rumors of experimentation deepened during this time. One dismissed footman later testified that he had seen Isabella carried from the cellar in the dead of night, her body limp, her wrists marked by bruises. Another claimed he heard Jeremiah dictating to Zimmerman about the effect of alternating doses, half night, half morning. None of this was formally recorded in medical journals, yet fragments of Jeremiah's notes support the allegation. 31 in Twitch fragment, preserved in the Allegheny County archives. Jeremiah wrote, "The fifth subject shows marked resistance to soporific compounds, must increase dosage, curvature of hand observed, eye movements rapid in state of partial wake. Subject mutters phrases that do not correspond with consciousness. 31 in 27,900. By early 1848, Isabella's condition had worsened to a state described as near constant trembling. Servants reported that she would sit at the window for hours, fingers drumming the sill in a ceaseless rhythm, muttering the same phrases again and again. I am still here, I am still here, I am still here. 31 in 24,600. Yet Isabella, like Anne before her, left traces of resistance. Hidden among her hymnals were small scraps of paper scrawled with warnings. He is feeding me poison. Do not trust the water. Remember the others. One such scrap was discovered decades later during a renovation of the West Wing, wedged between the boards of the music room floor. 31 in 26. Unlike his earlier wives, Isabella's decline did not remain a private matter. Guests at the estate in March 1848 remarked openly upon her appearance. Her hair, once described as lustrous chestnut, had thinned alarmingly. Her laughter had been replaced by a brittle silence. At a gathering that spring, she reportedly stood from the dining table and asked aloud, "How many of us must fall before the city sees what he is?" 31 in 24,440. The silence that followed was heavier than stone. Jeremiah excused her with a smile, blaming female fancies, but the Crane family took notice. Nathaniel Crane visited the estate unannounced 2 weeks later. He was refused entry. 31 in 60. By the summer of 1848, Isabella's decline was irreversible. Witnesses describe her pacing the halls at night, humming tuneless fragments of music, her fingertips bloodied from scratching the banisters. Servants heard her speak to unseen figures, calling the names of Margaret, Elena, Catherine and Anne. 31 in 27. One maid, years later, recalled a chilling moment. She stood at the top of the stairs, her eyes hollow, her lips trembling, and she said, "They are all waiting. They are waiting for me too." 31 in 20. On September 14, 1848, Isabella collapsed during the night. Jeremiah announced she had suffered a seizure and expired before aid could be summoned. A death certificate was filed swiftly, signed by Dr. Zimmerman, citing congenital weakness of the nerves. No inquest was ordered. She was buried within the week in the Crane family plot, though no family members were permitted to view her body. 31 in 2046. The aftermath of Isabella's death proved catastrophic for Jeremiah. The Crane family, unlike the Fletchers before them, wielded influence too vast to ignore. Nathaniel Crane accused Jeremiah of murder in private circles, and though no formal charges were ever brought, Jeremiah's reputation collapsed. His lectures were cancelled, his partnerships dissolved, and his estate fell into disrepair. 31 in 20. By 1850, the Hartwell estate stood as a hushed monument to ruin. Neighbors spoke of screams still carried on the night air, of windows shuttered even in daylight, of a man seen wandering the halls alone, muttering the names of his lost wives. Jeremiah lived on in seclusion, attended only by Dr. Zimmerman and a dwindling staff, his experiments continuing in silence.
These series are 143:14.
Though Isabella's story closed the chapter on Jeremiah's marriages, but opened another, the reckoning of public memory. Her warnings, her scraps of paper, her defiant words at the table, these became fragments of evidence carried in whispers across Pennsylvania, repeated by servants and retold by neighbors. They were not enough to convict Jeremiah in court, but they were enough to shape his legacy into one of dread.
These series are 14300.
Later generations would call Isabella the last bride, but also the loudest, for while the others slipped into silence or vanished into rumor, Isabella left behind a resonance, a final echo that could not be erased. Her voice, fractured though it became, marked the turning point. From her the story ceased to be private tragedy and became communal horror. Either 4041-900. And so with Isabella's passing, the grim chronicle of the 5 Hartwell wives reached its end. Yet Jeremiah's experiments, his notes and his unrepentant solitude would carry the horror into its next phase, one not bound by marriage but by obsession, secrecy and the shadow that lingers still in the records. The descent of Jeremiah's 0045-18720. By the dawn of the 1850s, Jeremiah Hartwell was no longer regarded as a man of science or society. He was a specter in his own home, a physician whose name evoked unease rather than admiration. The death of Isabella Crane had severed the last of his respectable ties. Without the protection of marriage alliances or medical appointments,
Jeremiah retreated fully into seclusion. Servants, now reduced to a skeletal staff of 2 maids and a groundskeeper, described the estate as a mausoleum. Curtains remained drawn, mirrors covered in sheets, and the once proud gardens lay in ruin. Jeremiah himself, once meticulously groomed, appeared increasingly disheveled, hair unkempt, beard streaked with white, eyes ringed with sleepless shadows. He spent most of his hours in the cellar laboratory, where the air was thick with chemical odors and a constant metallic ringing, as though glass vials were perpetually trembling.
Series 4619 carriage.
His journals from this decade reveal a profound shift. Where earlier volumes blended clinical precision with personal reflection, the later writings descended into feverish ramblings. Pages were crammed with diagrams of the human brain, overlapping sketches of the wives' faces, and passages that merged scripture, alchemy, and anatomy in equal measure. They called it madness in them, but brilliance in me. The threshold is narrow, I must cross it. They were not failures, they were doorways.
Series 4652 that.
The townsfolk whispered of strange activity at the estate. Candlelight flickered in the cellar at all hours. Cartloads of supplies, glass jars, medical instruments, and unidentified powders were delivered at night. On one occasion, a blacksmith reported forging restraints of curious design at Jeremiah's insistence. The man later refused to speak of it again. 4721-600. Local children dared each other to approach the gates. They told of hearing muffled cries from underground, though no evidence was ever found. When questioned, Jeremiah dismissed these rumors as hysteria among the ignorant. Yet his surviving notebooks suggest otherwise. One fragment reads, "Subject B has survived 3 nights without nourishment. Though the mutterings grow louder, the eyes do not close. The pulse continues erratically. I cannot tell whether it is she or the others speaking through her."
Series 4755.
Who subject B remains unclear. Some historians argue he had begun experimenting on the bodies of his deceased wives, attempting to preserve or reanimate fragments of their being. Others insist he lured patients or vagrants to the estate under pretense of medical treatment. No definitive records survive, only scattered testimonies and the increasingly incoherent notes. 4825. 8. The groundskeeper, in a statement taken years later, recalled hearing Jeremiah speak to unseen figures. He would walk the corridors at night, whispering as if answering questions. Once I heard him stop outside the locked chamber and say, "No, not yet. The 5th still resists. She will not let the others through." 40. Booksellers reported him purchasing volumes on mesmerism, necromancy, and Egyptian funerary rites. A surviving receipt from 1853 shows the acquisition of De Occulta Philosophia by Agrippa and a German translation of Paracelsus on the nature of spirit. Marginalia in these texts, preserved in the Carnegie archives, are scrawled with phrases like, "The boundary is thinnest in the hour before dawn," and 5 vessels, 1 key.
Series 40 turns.
4931-600. Neighbors began to avoid the Hartwell property altogether. Carriages rerouted to avoid the lane. Ministers warned parishioners against the house of decay. Still Jeremiah endured, sustained by what he called the great work. 4952. His physician, Dr. Zimmerman, remained his only companion, whether accomplice, confidant, or captive. Zimmerman's role remains contested. Letters recovered from Zimmerman's estate decades later suggest ambivalence. He compels me with a force I cannot name. His eyes burn with a vision I fear yet cannot wholly reject. To leave him is to abandon medicine itself, for he believes he stands at the edge of revelation. 5027-88. By 1855 the estate was entirely closed to visitors. Deliveries ceased. The last of the staff departed under mysterious circumstances, leaving Jeremiah and Zimmerman alone. Records of this period are scarce, but fragments suggest Jeremiah had begun what he termed the synthesis. In one particularly chilling passage, he wrote, "5 vessels, broken yet whole, each bore madness, yet through madness lies the key. If their voices can be bound together, the threshold will open. Through them, eternity." 51. Some see it as metaphor, Jeremiah grappling with guilt and obsession, projecting unity onto the tragedy of his wives. Others fear it was literal, an attempt to combine elements of their remains, their voices, their memories into a single experiment. 5126. 6-7. Reports from nearby farms suggest screams were indeed heard that winter-piercing, inhuman, carrying across the frozen fields. One farmer described it as a chorus, 5 voices wailing at once. Though unverifiable, The timing aligns with the notes in Jeremiah's journal that abruptly end in February 8, 51:54-40. For nearly a year after, nothing was seen or heard from the estate. The house stood silent, the windows dark. Some believed Jeremiah had died, others that he had fled. It was not until 1857 that investigators, spurred by the Crane family's relentless pressure, forced entry into the mansion. 52, eating Twanner. What they found within has become legend. The dining hall was stripped bare, walls lined with jars of cloudy liquid. The laboratory below reeked of decay. Instruments of grotesque design lay scattered across tables, and in the far chamber, 5 chairs were arranged in a circle, each bound with leather straps, each stained dark with what could only be blood. 52, 47. Only a final journal remained, open upon a desk. The last entry, dated February 3, 1856, read, "The threshold trembles. They are here, but not yet whole. I have stepped across. When the circle closes, so too shall the world's." 53, 1907. His disappearance marked the climax of the Hartwell horror. No trace of Jeremiah was ever found. Some claimed he fled abroad, others that he perished in his own experiment. The more superstitious whispered that he succeeded, that he had crossed into some realm between life and death, dragging his 5 wives with him. 53, 46. Twanner. Whatever the truth, the Hartwell estate stood abandoned, its windows hollow, its halls echoing with memory. Children grew up warning one another never to approach. Ministers refused to consecrate the grounds, and yet scholars, thrill seekers and occultists would return for decades, seeking answers in the shadows Jeremiah left behind. 54 in 1288. The descent of Jeremiah Hartwell was not simply the unraveling of a man, but the opening of a legend, a darkness that did not die with him, but instead took root in the soil of Allegheny County, waiting to be unearthed. The investigations. 40, 41. The forced entry of 1857 did not end the matter of the Hartwell estate. It only widened it. What was expected to be a straightforward inquiry into abandonment and debt quickly dissolved into something far stranger. The Allegheny County Sheriff's men, upon discovering the laboratory chambers, refused to remain more than an hour in the house. Their official report speaks in clipped, formal terms. Objects of curious design, substances of no clearer origin, a condition of advanced neglect. But private correspondence between deputies, preserved by descendants, paints a darker picture. 5550. None of these details entered the formal record. Instead, the county quietly sealed the estate and transferred guardianship to the Crane family, who promptly disclaimed it, citing its ruinous condition and unholy reputation. 5547. A second investigation was launched in late 1858, this time by a panel of physicians and ministers, assembled under public pressure. Among them was Dr. Elias Murdoch, a surgeon of Presbyterian faith, who insisted on a rigorous documentation. His journal remains one of the most valuable surviving accounts. 56. 11900. Murdoch writes of the descent into the cellar. The odor is of a sweetness that clings to the throat, as though decay itself had learned perfume. Along the walls glass containers, wherein I beheld fragments unfit to name, eyes, hands perhaps, or only the suggestion of such. The arrangement bespoke neither medicine nor anatomy, but some third thing beyond the scope of natural science. 56, 46. Fourth. At the chamber of the 5 chairs, Murdoch grew shaken. He noted the straps worn and stiff with dark stains, and beneath each chair a copper basin, corroded but unmistakably used. It was not the presence of death that disturbed us, he wrote, but the deliberate symmetry. There is design in horror, and design speaks of intent. 57:19. He heard or believed he heard, whispering that darted just beyond comprehension. 5 voices, layered but unharmonized. 57:44-900. Word of this spread, and the Hartwell estate entered local folklore. Children sang rhymes of 5 wives in the cellar, and travelers avoided the lane. Yet others, spiritualists, mesmerists and occultists, were drawn to it as if to a beacon. By the early 1860s, the house became a site of clandestine gathering. Reports mentioned seances, conducted in the dining halls, circles drawn in chalk around the chairs, and self-styled mediums claiming to hear Jeremiah's choir. 58:1903. It was only after the war that order was reimposed. A decree in 1867 forbade entry to the Hartwell property under penalty of fine, citing public endangerment. Yet even this could not still the fascination. 58:8. 45,500, in the archives of the Pittsburgh Gazette. An article dated October 1871 describes a fire on the grounds. Locals reported seeing a column of flame rising from the cellar vent, accompanied by screams, "Not of this earth." When investigators arrived, no damage was found above ground, only scorch marks inside the chamber of 5 chairs. The basins had melted to slag. How fire came to be contained in that room alone was never explained. 59-21-800. Survivors of the Crane family, still bitter from Isabella's fate, pressed again for the demolition of the house, yet legal disputes over ownership prevented action. The estate lingered in limbo, decaying but its presence weighed heavily on Allegheny County, a blight that could not be excised. 59-47-300. Through the 1880s and 1890s, amateur historians began to collect fragments of Jeremiah's surviving note. Many had been sold quietly by scavengers, pages torn from journals, loose diagrams, scraps of correspondence between him and Dr. Zimmerman. Pieced together, these fragments suggested a coherent obsession, the union of 5 vessels into one voice. One chilling line scrawled across a half-burned page reads, "I failed with flesh, but flesh was never the true medium. The voice remains when the vessel rots. 5 voices, if they may be made to sing as one, will open the way." 100. Scholars debated whether this meant Jeremiah had pursued necromancy, early psychiatry, or some grotesque fusion of both. Yet for the families who had lost daughters to him, the debate mattered little. To them the horror was no theory but legacy. 51-700. Oral accounts from the Crane, Atwood and Mallory lines tell of dreams that plagued descendants. Women reported waking to the sound of whispers, always in groups of 5, though no words could be discerned. Men described visions of a man in a blood-stained coat, seated in a circle, calling them nearer. These testimonies, though impossible to verify, appeared consistently over generations. 13900. By the turn of the century, interest in the Hartwell estate had reached beyond the county. Folklorists from Boston and New York traveled to document the legends. The house itself, weather-worn and skeletal, still stood, its roof sagging, its windows gaping like sockets. In 1903, a team of investigators from the Society for Psychical Research conducted a week-long study there. Their published report describes cold drafts, unexplained sounds, and most unsettling, a photograph in which 5 blurred shapes appeared behind the investigators, though no one had been present. The report concludes, if hauntings are to be measured by persistence, then the Hartwell case stands unique, for here we find not one restless spirit, but a polyphony, 5 dissonant voices, bound not by chance but by design.